Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lenora Henson, and I'm the Curator and Director of Public Programming here at the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and our staff, I'd like to welcome all of you to Speaker Night. I'd especially like to welcome Dr. Veronica Martinez-Matsuda, who will be speaking to us this evening about making unfree labor, from Asian exclusion to the U.S.-Mexico border wall. Speaker Night is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to come in and help us think about some of the issues that were important during TR's presidency and continue to be relevant today. Among those issues are labor and immigration, which is where Dr. Martinez-Matsuda's research and expertise comes in. Dr. Martinez-Matsuda is joining us this evening from Ithaca, where she is an assistant professor at Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. She received her PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin, where her dissertation was awarded the Barnes F. Lathrop Prize for Best Dissertation in the Department of History. It was also awarded runner-up for the Best Dissertation Prize by the journal Labor History. Prior to arriving at Cornell University's ILR school, Dr. Martinez-Matsuda had held fellowship positions at Bryn Mawr College, Rhodes College, and the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. I'm a little jealous there. Dr. Martinez-Matsuda's teaching fields of interest and expertise include 20th century U.S. social and cultural history, the Great Depression and the New Deal, immigration-migration history, Chicano and Latino studies, U.S.-Mexican borderland studies, women's history, and comparative race and ethnic studies. She's currently writing a book on the history of U.S. migratory farm labor camp program and its role in the lives of diverse migrant farm worker families across the United States during the mid-1930s and 1840s. We're delighted to have her expertise, and I'm very happy to turn the podium over to Dr. Martinez-Matsuda. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out on what turned out to be a really nice evening. I was seeing that on my drive here from Ithaca, there was like a sketchy patch there where this great cloud came and the wind started blowing and everybody pulled to the side. I mean, it really was kind of frightening. So much different than what I left in Ithaca. It was like 86 degrees today. So anyway, thank you for coming out this evening. I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you especially to Lenora Henson for the invitation to join you at your speaker night. I've really been excited about this opportunity. Thank you to all of the staff who prepared for the presentation today, and with that, I'll begin. So in preparation for this talk, I started to think about the fact that it feels like an especially volatile time period. Everyone's sort of talking about that, like, whoa, this, we're living through something really remarkable. And it, of course, leads a historian to question, well, how will that be represented in the future? And in particular, I was emailing back and forth this week with a group of friends that I met in graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, which you mentioned. Because as you may have heard, on Sunday, late at night, in the middle of the night, some trucks pulled in and removed, to talk about these covert operations, removed the Confederate statues, which sat on the main mall in the university. And as I was told in my first tour of the campus, faced south purposefully to project this idea of the South rising again. So I shouldn't share. Well, you can probably guess my opinion. The title at the top. So we, were just saying how I think there was a moment in which, in fact, we were organizing around the issue because we were trying to get the Cesar Chavez statue, which eventually in 2007 was erected on campus, and there was such politics around protecting the Confederate statue. So we just thought, wow, we didn't expect to ever see this happening. So that did lead me to think through, in fact, how remarkable it is that we're seeing these things occur. But at the same time, I'm kind of cautious about this idea that what we're living through is unique, because as I start reflecting back, I feel like most generations probably say that they lived through volatile times in one form or another. Certainly, different parts of the American population experienced justices, which I'll speak to in terms of immigration. So that idea of being mindful about what in fact makes these events unique and what kinds of questions we should be asking in terms of how this will be represented, because that's in fact what a lot of the academics who are reflecting on the whole Confederate statue issue, I don't know if you've been following, but the New York Times has published a couple of pieces by a well-known historian, Eric Bonner, F-O-N-E-R, if you're curious, and he's a historian of the Reconstruction era. And so, part of what he says is that, of course, this is a debate about whose history is being represented, and that monuments are not so much telling of the history in which they're said to represent, but more telling about when they're erected, and in this case, when they're dismantled, right? So I'm very curious about what makes this particular, but part of what inspired my talk this evening, which aims to put part of the sort of politics in historical perspective, in particular in relation to our current immigration debates, is this idea of thinking through what historians call the long lens act, right? How this sort of relates to how it can be contextualized historically. So with that, let me begin with a little bit of just again, I guess, to situate where the idea for this talk came from. So when I received Lenore's invitation to participate in the speaker series, it was only a couple months after President Trump announced 2 executive orders concerning immigration. You might be familiar with that. The first was an order for, quote, border security and immigration enforcement improvements, signed on January 25th, 2017. And the second, signed 2 days later, was an order for, quote, protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. Both executive orders were very much couched in terms of national security and apparently put forth in response to recent terrorist attacks in, for example, Paris and San Bernardino, which both occurred in 2015. So they were presented to us as direct federal action, quick action in response to the political and economic pressures of our current society. But because I was just getting started with the spring course, my spring course on U.S. immigration history when these executive orders were signed, I couldn't help but think about how they were rooted in past actions and policies surrounding immigration control. So I'd like to provide you with a little bit of an outline of what I want to speak on this evening, because I feel like there's quite a few topics which may not initially appear as interrelated, but I'm going to do my best to tie them together for you. So 3 main topics and little bullet points are the examples that I'll dive into. So this is what I mean by thinking through how these executive orders in particular are rooted in historical legacies and experiences that tell us a lot about what we're experiencing today. So to do this, to explain this, I'll first talk about the politics surrounding Asian exclusion, more specifically how Asian exclusion laws during the late 19th and early 20th century created the apparatus, the bureaucracy, and the systems for immigration enforcement that have made us what scholars in immigration call a gatekeeping nation. Okay? How we draft these types of policies, these executive orders to guard ourselves from potential terror is our current example. And then to work from this, no pun intended there, I'm going to discuss how these efforts to regulate immigrant entry through the early 20th century then lead to the creation of the US-Mexico border wall. All right, so how do we get to the US-Mexico border as the principal site of immigration enforcement, where this gatekeeping happens, right? That this is the place where illegality needs to be regulated. And this occurs especially develops especially in the years immediately following Theodore Roosevelt's death in 1919. And what I want to emphasize here is a term that historian May Nite has introduced called territoriality, the territoriality of immigration restriction politics. She uses this term to describe the almost normative association we have today with our southern border as the location or the place of immigrant illegality. In other words, the notion that, again, that the southern border is where our nation needs to focus our attention to unauthorized entry, to drug smuggling, and to other criminal activity. But I also hope to show that while there's a specific material consequence of immigration enforcement that leads to the creation of the border wall, the physical manifestation of territoriality, There's also a cultural social territoriality that we all live through, that we all experience, a more conceptual space of immigrant regulation that's also built during this period. And that's important too because it's part of what keeps immigrants from feeling free, politically speaking, to become full citizens once they're in the United States. This more social cultural space of immigrant regulation is also important because it helps explain why in the 21st century, in fact, this very evening, we have so many people in places even far removed from the US-Mexico border chanting "Build the Wall." So as I was leaving my hotel room, CNN was capturing shots of President Trump landing in Arizona, where he'll speak in Phoenix this evening, and apparently the crowd's already getting excited and chanting "Build the Wall." And I should emphasize that while we heard this call, and we're hearing this call loud and clear during Trump's presidential campaign and term, in reality, most, if not all, presidents since at least the mid-1970s have supported building or expanding the border wall as part of their strategy for immigration control. In fact, the actual construction of the border wall begins during Bill Clinton's first term in office in 1993 and expands considerably in the second term of office in 1996. So, in other words, both Republicans and Democrats have sought to advance what scholars have now termed the militarization of the border, by which I mean not just the construction of the border wall, but also increased Border Patrol enforcement, so the rise of Border Patrol officers, the use of military technology, often very direct from US wars and equipment, and various environmental strategies to deter unauthorized entry. Moving to the second point here, what I want to do next is to then open it up to a more broader discussion about the forces and consequences behind these immigration policies. And this is where the unmaking part of the talk comes in. Since I teach at the ILR school, I'm always thinking about how big business plays the role that it plays in immigration enforcement and in motivating immigration restriction policies. And more specifically, how the relationship between big business and labor interests, which can also come from sort of the bottom up, have mobilized politicians to regulate immigrant entry. Theodore Roosevelt was, of course, very influential in trust busting and quite significantly concerned about curtailing the power corporations had to influence political processes and legislation. But today, much like during the Gilded Age, corporate interests have a heavy hand in shaping immigration policy in ways that I don't think most Americans are aware of. Bernie Sanders sort of helped make this more of a discussion, but even Bernie wasn't so much talking about the politics of immigration in that relationship. So what has resulted from the current policies to regulate immigration, as I've already hinted at, is that it's created an immigrant workforce, most notably at the low-wage, low-skill level, which is what I study, that is especially vulnerable to exploitation, and not just from employers, because they lack the legal protections to contest their condition and to experience full citizenship. This, I argue, is what makes them unfree in a way that we don't often think about in the 21st century. So, for those of you who have maybe studied a little bit about unfree labor academically, you might think of chattel slavery, or maybe even sort of the socialist call for wage slavery or indentured servitude. But here I'm talking about the condition which similarly perhaps keeps workers from advocating for themselves, from sort of receiving the basic sort of human rights that they are entitled to, that they should merit. And as a third topic, I'd like to end by taking some time to talk about my current book project. I mentioned to Lenore in anticipation of this presentation that I was deep into my own book, which I need to finish soon. And so I thought that it would be useful, maybe a little selfishly, to present some of the ideas that I've been working on, present a little bit about the project, test my market, as my editor says. I assume most of you are history buffs, so you can tell me if there's something that's not quite working. But also, in all joking aside, in all truth, there's really important connections here, I think, for what I study in terms of thinking about how, especially the call for progressive reform that Theodore Roosevelt advanced, And for federal intervention, that's really kind of the key issue here, to regulate economic inequity, to enhance the principles of American democracy, how those ideas influence later action in really remarkable ways that I hope we too in this current era can take inspiration from. So what I'll discuss more specifically is, as Lenora mentioned, the role of the Farm Security Administration's Migratory Labor Camp Program, which existed from 1935 to 1947. And we'll use this as a way to think through the historical links between Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And I hope to, again, hear some of your ideas of that. I know this is a lot to chew on. I promise I'll move through it carefully, cautiously, and leave enough time for Q&A so that we can discuss it. So when President Trump's executive orders concerning immigration were announced, various historians of the Asian American experience, including, for example, Julie Yoon, Erica Lee, Gordon Chan, and Nite, who I've already mentioned, pointed to the parallels today and the political climate of the Asian exclusion era. So because there's been some time passed since the executive orders announced, I thought we would start with a quick review of these policies. So the first order that I'm referring to, again, is the Border Security and Immigration Enforcement Improvement Order, signed and introduced on January 25th, 2017. Among other things, it intends to fortify the nation's borders by expanding the U.S.-Mexico border wall, constructing what Trump called an impassable physical barrier. It also mandates hiring at least 5,000 more Border Patrol agents and building additional facilities to detain immigrants near the U.S.-Mexico border, so right there at the border on site. And this would, as he suggested, end the practice of catch and release, which actually is not really as widely practiced as it sort of was alluded to in the introduction of this executive order. But basically, it's a practice which allows immigrants to be released on bond while they await their immigration hearing. Very few Mexican origin migrants would qualify for that. So again, there's some discrepancy there. And then finally, the order also calls for expanding the process of expedited removal. This means increasing efforts to round up and remove some of the estimated 11 to 12 million unauthorized immigrants living in the United States today. To do so, the order calls for reinstating controversial policies like the 287G program and the Secure Communities program introduced under Obama's administration, which again would require local law enforcement agencies to enforce federal immigration law. They would do this by acting as immigration officers, checking people's status, and apprehending and detaining people in custody even if they came into the system for minor infractions. The thing that immigration scholars like to point to is even for a routine traffic stop, right? You can end up in ICE detention. The current status of this order, Congress has not approved any funding for it yet. Projected expenditures range from $15 to $25 billion. According to President Trump, and I heard this on the news this evening, construction companies are currently making bids on the project. Money's coming in for support for the project, and plans are definitely being drafted and developed. Of course, beyond the economic costs, however, there are also many other consequences to expanding our southern border. And one of the factors that would have surely concerned Theodore Roosevelt, the conservationist, is the well-documented devastating environmental impact the wall will have if constructed as Trump plans. And maybe it's a little hard to read this from where you're at, so I'm going to see if I can highlight some things here. So the line is the U.S.-Mexico national line, dividing U.S. and Mexico. The orange is the proposed additions under the 2007 Secure Fence Act. So not all of that has been completed or was constructed, but it sort of shows the areas regionally where that was being concentrated. And the further additions under the Trump administration are then, again, to completely fortify, right? So any sort of empty spots Trump is proposing to show in. And this is, you can you can Google this if you'd like, but the map comes up on several sites. Where I found it was outdoorproject.org. But part of what environmental groups are trying to highlight is the fact that there are various national parks and protected areas, and I'm sort of reading this for you, wildlife refuge sites on both the Mexico and U.S. side of the border, and there are mutual sort of transnational interests that have worked historically to maintain these sites. So a lot of sort of binational work there that are being endangered by this proposal. In fact, even after the 2006-2007 Secure Fence Act was passed, these academics looking at the environmental cost pointed out numerous environmental laws that were pushed aside, including the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act, to name just a few. Consequently, these environmental and conservation organizations like the Sierra Club and Defenders of Wildlife have come out quite strongly against President Trump's proposal. And this, again, has, there's diversity here. This has less to do with the idea of regulating unauthorized entry and more sort of a concentration, again, about the environmental costs, right? So they're saying it's, the proposal is less effective for holding back humans than it is for holding back animals, right, wildlife, and that's not our intention, should not be our intention, they argue. The second order was signed just a few days after the first, so this is partly why they were paired together. Signed on January 27, 2017, protecting the nation from foreign terrorist entry into the United States. It aimed to immediately deny entry to immigrants from 7 Muslim-majority countries, hence the reference to this as a Muslim ban. The countries are Syria, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, and Somalia for approximately 90 days. It also intended to suspend all refugee resettlement for 120 days and to reduce the number of refugees resettled in the United States for the 2017 fiscal year to 50,000 people. This is approximately 60,000 less than what was planned under the Obama administration. Under the original order, Syrian refugees were singled out for an indefinite ban. The order also stated that refugee claims would be prioritized on the basis of religious-based persecution, provided that the religion of the individual is a minority religion in the individual's country of nationality. So for many, again, this reinforced the idea that it was a Muslim ban since it appeared to prioritize Christian refugees. Despite the immediate criticism and the chaos, which you probably saw and covered well on the media, that the policy created at our nation's airports, Trump argued that he was doing the right thing for national security. He claimed that the order was, quote, a necessary step to stop radical Islamic terrorists from coming to the United States and carrying out attacks on U.S. soil. After the first ban faced multiple legal challenges, Trump issued another executive order on March 6, essentially revising the first ban. Under the new order, Iraqi nationals were no longer targeted. This was after the Defense Department warned that the ban could hurt our military partners in conflict zones like Iraq. Additionally, the ban was revised so that there would be more consideration of case-by-case exemptions from the targeted countries. So, for example, for green card holders, for dual nationals, for diplomats or other people who previously been granted asylum or refugee status. And this was to avoid the confusion which we witnessed happening during the first ban, where people were detained at the airports who should have legally been allowed in, at least under our current refugee policy and sort of other legal agreements. Under the revised proposal, Syrian refugees were no longer singled out for an indefinite ban. Instead, they fell under the general ban. And finally, refugees and minority religious groups were also no longer prioritized for acceptance after Trump was advised that this would not pass any sort of legal standing because it might be considered religious discrimination. On March 14th, however, this second ban was also blocked by 2 federal judges, one in Hawaii and one in Maryland, And while most of the restricted elements of this order did not hold, it has no doubt created a hostile climate for refugee admission to the United States, which continues. Now, to help situate these orders in historical context, Asian American historians remind us that there are various similarities in the social, economic, and political environment that produced these orders and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which lasted from 1882 to 1943. And I would push that even further to include the Gentleman's Agreement between the United States and Japan, signed by Theodore Roosevelt in 1907. And what I thought I would do to sort of maybe give you a visual sense of how these things are represented before I kind of dive into some of the arguments. I thought what I'd do is share a couple of political cartoons from the era of Asian exclusion and Chinese exclusion more specifically, because once I started looking at the imagery, and some of these I kind of recalled from my immigration course, but I haven't thought about in this context. But others were sort of in preparation for this talk. I went to some of the sites that I know where the Library of Congress, for example, provides a lot of analysis on some of these images. And I was really surprised by how many of them reference things like walls, right? And the kinds of ideas that we're grappling with today. So just a quick example. This is an image titled The Anti-Chinese Wall. The American Wall goes up as the Chinese original goes down. And it was published in Puck Magazine, March 29, 1982. In the cartoon, this is one depiction of it. It shows ethnic workers, with which other analyses are sort of more direct to say Irish, African Americans, Italians, Jewish immigrants, and I think one even said veterans, although I don't know how they gathered that. Building a wall against the Chinese. And congressional mortar is what's used to mount the blocks of prejudice, of non-reciprocity, of a law against race, of fear. Here you have jealousy, non-reciprocity, anti-low wages, competition. And they're building the wall while across the way, right, across the sea, a ship flying the American flag enters China as the Chinese knock down their own wall and permit trade of such goods as rice, tea, and silk. So here's an example. I've used this image before to talk about the sort of conflict of between or among ethnic immigrants, but I had never thought through previously what is a very similar discourse today about the sort of growth of neoliberal trade and, sort of thinking through proposals like NAFTA, which is a hot topic for Trump as well. And what immigration scholars like to argue is an opening of borders for this sort of increased globalization, while we are still fueling the idea of the gatekeeping nation, closed borders to actual immigrants, migrants, workers. So I thought that was also very useful to think through that idea. This is the image I used to advertise the talk, or to open the talk. And this is a very, I think, clear depiction, right, of the connections here around Asian exclusion and the executive orders, especially around building the wall. If you're not aware of this, Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist, he's, I think, better known for his cartoons that really depict a kind of anti-Irish sentiment. He was his favorite figure to draw was Boss Queen, Tammany Hall, and just amazing cartoons I love to teach with. But one of the complexities that I highlight in some of my lectures is the way that he was very sympathetic to the Chinese question. So there's a really interesting contradiction there that maybe we could talk about in the Q&A. But this is one of his cartoons. It's entitled "Throwing Down the Ladder by Which They Rose," published in 1871 before the Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. And what it features is European immigrants intended to be depicted as Irish and German, according to most analysis of the image, that now declare, right, now that they've scaled the wall of immigration, they now declare that Chinese access to America is closed. The man at the top has his arms extended to proclaim victory, native victory, and to the right, a flag waves declaring the new American territory belonging to the Know-Nothings. Most of you probably know about the Know-Nothing part, but we could talk about that too, a very prominent nativist group which ironically was most active in trying to prevent Irish immigration. So, but here you have Irish and Germans coming together, and that's what this references as well. Irish President Patrick and Vice President Holmes, right, the German Vice President. So now that they've scaled this land of opportunity, they've claimed the ladder of immigration to achieve the American dream, they now deny it to others. So he's very cleverly highlighting this critique of how could you forget, right, that just a few decades before you were the victims of these kinds of restrictionist proposals, and now you are the ones advancing them. The next one. There we go. Is entitled The Chinese Question Again, 1889. So this is after the Exclusion Act passes, and there's, of course, all kinds of amendments to the Exclusion Act. Again, it's not repealed until 1943, and most of the amendments involve both extending the period of exclusion. I'll show you a slide about the exclusion law itself. So most of them involve extending the period of exclusion and the kind of scope, right? So that it wasn't just Chinese immigrants coming from China, but from anywhere in the world. There was a lot of anxiety, I guess you can say, in American society about the fact that maybe the exclusion policies weren't working as well as one would hope. So this image, the Chinese question again, and I couldn't find who it credits, but it was published in the WASP, and it features Uncle Sam holding this door labeled Scots Exclusion Act, which I'll explain in a minute. And he's trying to hold it closed, but the Chinese immigrants are coming in. It's part of the yellow peril trope of the Chinese as sneaky, cunning immigrants. And so they're able to penetrate our border, our gates, our walls through many fronts, through Canada, through Mexico, through habeas corpus route, as prior residents, I think it's called that British Columbia, as students, as merchant fraud. So some of the exempt categories in exclusion pretend, providing false documents to say that this is their identity. There's a period in exclusion, in Chinese exclusion, where all Chinese laborers who had certificates, who should have been allowed re-entry into the United States, were denied entrance. This affected approximately 20,000 people. So some scholars even point to this very specific historical moment as a good evidence similarity to the kind of chaos that we saw at the airports, with this kind of so intense period of gatekeeping that even people who might have had legal protections to enter back in found themselves victims, right, of our immigration policy. So there are several, I think, really useful and kind of fun visual arguments about the relationship here. But as I mentioned in my opening, several Asian American historians published really powerful pieces to highlight some of the ways that we should be thinking through Trump's executive orders historically. So, for example, Erica Lee argues that much like today, the economic anxieties of the white working class greatly influenced passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. In their labor unions and community-based organizations, they demanded that the Chinese must go, claiming that the Chinese lowered wages, took away jobs, drained the economy, and so forth. And similar to today, exclusion advocates rallied political support for their cause during a close and contentious presidential election. In the 1876 presidential election between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden, as you might recall, Tilden of New York wins the popular vote, but there's some ambiguity over the electoral votes. This should sound familiar. And so Hayes becomes president through what we now know as the Compromise of 1877. He agrees to remove federal troops from the South, formally ending Reconstruction era. That's to tie back to my Confederate folders. It's all linked. Another similarity that's important to point to is the way that Chinese exclusion specifically targets immigrants on the basis of race, national origin, and class. And surprisingly, even the popular media in our current era pointed to this comparison when the executive orders were first announced. They saw the direct targeting comparison. But what I think is important to note here as well is that during exclusion, much like today, there wasn't any real evidence to back the claim that Chinese workers had caused the economic recessions of the late 1870s, as some contended, or that they were, in the cultural sense, unassimilatable disease carriers who posed threats to the country, the sort of social cultural side of Yellow Peril. As Judy Yoon notes, Trump's executive orders similarly scapegoat and homogenize Muslim refugees, claiming as he did that, quote, Islam hates us, and that all Muslims are potential terrorists, despite the fact that all of the fatal terror attacks carried on US soil since 9/11, according to a recent study by the ACLU, of all of these, none have been committed by immigrants from the 7 majority Muslim countries targeted by the ban. Earlier this year, the Department of Homeland Security also issued a similar report revealing that there's no evidence that citizens from the targeted countries pose a unique threat. So despite the knowledge that the ban will not make America safe, Trump tried to win public support by targeting Muslims and pandering to the rising public prejudice and hostility against them. Fueling racial hatred and religious intolerance was especially dangerous in the past because it incited mob violence, and we see that happening today as well. Finally, historians remind us that there's an important lesson in Chinese American resistance to the Exclusion Act, which again spanned multiple generations lasting 60 years. They resisted through the ports, which we're witnessing again today, and they resisted through their consumption practices. So one quick example, in 1905, Chinese merchants out of Shanghai called for a boycott of American imports. This was their way to pressure the United States to modify the exclusion policy. In response, President Theodore Roosevelt promised to reform the way immigration inspectors and officers treated Chinese immigrants upon arrival. And consequently, various measures were, this was one more cartoon by the laborers, I'll pause there for a second. A picture for employers. This is prior to passage of Chinese Exclusion Act, 1878 by Joseph Kepler. Why they can live on 40 cents a day and they can't, right? The Chinese immigrant workers and the American family, right? This sort of reference to the family wage, which was a big topic in labor debates at the time. We'll talk about this image as well. So, I'm going to sort of pause, go to this. So this is what I mean by introducing various measures to better streamline the bureaucracy of immigration enforcement as a result of again, Chinese American resistance and Chinese merchant boycott. So during Roosevelt's term, for example, he introduced measures to require better training for immigration inspectors and to provide for more capable translators during an immigrant's hearing. And it was also during Theodore Roosevelt's administration that construction for Angel Island began in California, which was to serve as the central processing and detention center. It opens in 1910 for Chinese immigrants, and other immigrants as well went through there, but primarily Chinese immigrants. And we know now that many detainees spent several years there, particularly if they were appealing their cases. And government documents suggest that living quarters at Angel Island were overcrowded, unsanitary, and unsafe, and that detainees were fed poor diets and forbidden from having visitors until their cases were settled. I'm going to return to that example in a bit. But with this point, let me now move into my discussion about the border wall, and I'm going to probably move through this somewhat more quickly to get us to the next topic. But I want to talk briefly now about the executive order calling to expand the U.S.-Mexico border wall and to increase this infrastructure today for immigration detention and expulsion. And hopefully through even some of the political cartoons and things that I've shown you thus far, you see how these two issues, Asian exclusion and the U.S.-Mexico border wall, are not as unevenly related as might first appear. So to emphasize this point, for example, it was the fear of illegal Chinese immigrants that first brought our attention to the U.S.-Mexico border in that territoriality sense, as a key site of illegality. Prior to Chinese exclusion, border crossing was mostly fluid, and our biggest concern was bootlegging. The evidence of Chinese immigrants entry, sometimes cleverly posing as Mexicans, as Erica Lee's work shows, focuses the nation's attention and resources to this as the site of immigrant illegality. So this is where immigration inspectors first learned to patrol the border and to develop the tactics for regulating and exposing unauthorized immigrant entry. As Lee and others remind us, when the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed in 1882, there isn't the kind of immigration bureaucracy that we know today. In fact, as the slide references, the Border Patrol itself is not even created until 1924. So the gatekeeping system that we rely on to determine immigrant entry in the 21st century, things like immigration officers and inspectors, the role of interviewers to determine false identities, the whole realm of documents and papers, medical inspections, immigration hearings, all of that stems from the Asian exclusion era. Today, despite evidence from the Department of Homeland Security, which points to the fact that unauthorized entries are at their lowest levels, across the US-Mexico border that is, and despite the fact that leading officials affiliated with the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement have come out publicly to state that this is probably not the most effective way, that is building a wall, to regulate unauthorized entry, President Trump and his supporters nevertheless demand that we build the wall, what he's referred to, that is Trump, as the Great Wall. Part of this Great Wall, as I've suggested, involves the physical fear of apprehension once immigrants cross into the United States. So in both seeking to expand immigration detention and fueling the policy of expedited removal, Trump is also building on a practice that would have been very familiar to Asian immigrant communities during the early 20th century. So, for example, here are two cartoons, and we'll say something really quick about them. The first is an advertisement for a washing machine, a magic washer, which promises not to turn your clothes yellow, and you shouldn't use it if you don't want to be dirty. But it carries this message, right, which again can be found in various cartoons and things like advertisements of this era, of this expulsion, right, of expedited removal, of getting rid of, right, of the threat. And the other is another NAST cartoon, Pluribus Unum, except the Chinese, 1882. And the reference here, you see there already the reference to documents. So the U.S. passport is what's featured here. The Chinese immigrants to come in. And some analyses have suggested that here we have the Temple of Liberty, but the architecture of this, and even the soldiers as they appear in their clothing, is to sort of reference, to critique the fact that the U.S. claims to be something different than the sort of European imperial, right, sort of powers, that we advance democracy and that we function in the sort of same, with the same intention. So while I'm using it here to highlight the gatekeeping side of it, there's also something about the kind of, again, relationship to kind of imperial power and globalization of this era, which is not the focus of my talk. So much like today's unauthorized immigrants, Asian immigrants lived under exclusion, fearing that they would be separated from their families, feeling threatened each time immigration officers raided their homes, their workplaces, their schools, and they did. Few people know about the sort of interior part of gatekeeping for the Chinese. And they realized that in a matter of minutes, they could lose their businesses, their community, their investments in American life, which in many cases was all they had known for younger generations. And because exclusion policies throughout the early 20th century, which include not just Chinese exclusion, but again, Japanese exclusion through the Gentleman's Agreement, and the denial of access to naturalization that carried through even the 1924 Immigration Act, that we know more popularly as the Quota Act. Right? The idea that Asians had no access to becoming U.S. citizens legally that they could not become naturalized. This reinforced the idea that Asian immigrants would live in a condition, right, of non-citizen status. This fear of getting caught, and particularly the limits that it placed on the way that immigrants operated in the United States, is part of what I argue we must consider shaping new and perilous forms of quote-unquote unfree labor conditions. Historically, in forbidding Asian immigrants from becoming naturalized, our immigration policies trapped them in a condition of non-citizenship that allowed for their exploitation as laborers. So ironically, an effort which originated with white collars calling attention to Chinese coolie labor, right, that they were brought here as slaves, driving down wages, producing an unfair labor system in the United States. This call for exclusion, the Chinese NYSCA, ultimately helped produce that very condition of unfreeness for some workers. And if we consider who profits from this, then as in now, it becomes easier to see the role that big business has played in mobilizing politicians to regulate immigrant entry. For example, agribusiness, which is what I study, has played a prominent role in forming our immigration policies. As we know well, perhaps in this region, this is an industry that has benefited greatly from restrictive measures that often trap farm workers, and unfortunately, I often find this to be quite literally, in some of the most exploited conditions. In this vulnerable, or to use the term that's currently in vogue for labor relations, in this precarious condition, farm workers are especially vulnerable because they lack the legal protections that would help them contest their situation, to walk off their jobs, perhaps, to find better work, to demand fair treatment. And this is true not just for unauthorized immigrant farm workers, but for all farm workers who are still not protected by our nation's labor laws. So even American farm workers are subject to this condition. During the 1930s, which is the period that I studied, the farm bloc was instrumental. They were the big business, right, behind keeping farm workers out of any New Deal policies that expanded industrial workers' rights to, for example, join unions, bargain collectively, or earn Social Security. So today, much like the Gilded Age, corporate interests have a heavy hand in creating the immigration policies that we're witnessing. One quick example, which I urge you to look into further if you're not familiar with this, is private companies' role in profiting from immigration detention. So to sort of hark back to Angel Island. That was a federally run detention center. What we have now are the rise of private funded detention centers, and so consequently these companies play a direct role in drafting and lobbying for the kind of policies that Trump has introduced. In 2016, only 8 out of 350 facilities used to hold immigrants were ICE owned and operated, were government owned and operated, 8 out of 350. Most are privately owned and run by prison companies like the Corrections Corporation of America and GEO Group, Inc. These companies understand that any immigration reform seeking to ease up on our gatekeeping policies would be a huge hit to their profits. As of 2014, the US spent over $5 million per day on immigration detention. This put the cost of detaining an immigrant in 2014 at just one immigrant at $159 per day. Consequently, these companies help frame the immigration battle the way we're now hearing it, as one of national security, so that we're all on board, because the need for increased security justifies expanding mandatory detention and sentencing laws. So they have a heavy, heavy hand in lobbying legislation to pass repressive restrictionist immigration laws. To give you a specific example, quick example of this again, both companies that I just mentioned, CCA and GEO, were involved in drafting and funding Arizona's SB 1070, which may be familiar to you all. It was a measure that required, among other things, for local police to arrest and charge anyone found with proper immigration documentation. It, in fact, inspires things like 287G and the Secure Communities Program. So although most of the law was deemed unconstitutional, there are parts of it which were very much, which are very much still present and now, again, being sort of repurposed under the Trump administration. And although Arizona wasn't able to achieve some of the objectives of SB 1070, it did spawn copycat laws, which you also heard about. So we have Arizona, and then Alabama, Georgia, Indiana, Utah, South Carolina, to name just a few. And again, the funding and the lobbying all coming from these private prison groups, and also the American Legislative Exchange Council, which you might have heard of, who have been behind a lot of the laws trying to recall our nation's labor laws. I'm thinking of Wisconsin and the whole battle there. So, because I'm starting to run out of time here, let me move quickly into the next topic to think through how progressivism, right, how federal intervention through progressive reform and the welfare state introduced during Theodore Roosevelt's time influence later actions to correct the kind of conditions that I described to advance the ideals of American democracy. On August 31, 1910, Theodore Roosevelt attended the dedication of the John Brown Memorial State Park in Osawatomie, if I said that correctly, Kansas. And to an audience that included mostly veterans of the Union Army, he advocated for, quote, new nationalism, which I Googled this term, and apparently it's now being sort of used by the alt-right, so I feel like really I'm not a conspiracist, but there's all these ways that these things are coming back to life in ways not intended. So in the speech, he stated, "I stand for a square deal. When I say that I'm for a square deal, I mean not merely that I stand for fair play under the present rules of the game, but that I stand for having those rules change so as to work for a more substantial equality of opportunity and a reward for equally good service." One word of warning, which I think is hardly necessary in Kansas: when I say that I want a square deal for the poor man, I do not mean that I want a square deal for the man who remains poor because he has not the energy to work for himself. If a man who has had a chance will not make good, then he has got to quit. And there's good reason this speech is now well circulated. It's in its length, it's very powerful, it has all kinds of wonderful references. And although Roosevelt may not have been thinking about immigration specifically when he references the poor man, I found it very fitting in terms of what I studied, because many immigrant rights advocates have made a similar point about the willingness, the drive that immigrant workers represent to prove their value, to sort of earn their citizenship. And there's some problematic elements to this discourse, but in that sort of call to make good, which Roosevelt is referencing here. And I also wanted to borrow from the speech to point to a moment when federal authorities did have the courage and strength to intervene on a remarkable way on behalf of marginalized workers, and in the name of building true democracy. And I'm actually now not going to talk about it because we've run out of time. So I'll just very briefly show you some images. This is from my current book project, the title of which Lenora already presented to you. And what I'm studying is the history of the Farm Security Administration, which was a New Deal agency under, right now I'm saying Theodore all the time, Franklin Roosevelt. And so it was, as I'm suggesting, a remarkable testament to the kind of policies that Theodore aspired to. Direct intervention for the most marginalized to correct inequalities for those that have not been visible, been marginalized, and to really promote the ideals of American democracy. This is a map showing you where some of those camps were located. And some quick pictures of the kinds of conditions you would have seen there. Housing designed by the nation's leading, and they really do mean leading, architects of modern design in 1930 and 1940. Community programs, libraries, schools, nursery programs, lunch programs, activities and lessons, workshops and first aid and in-home demonstration. And by far, the thing that people tell me in my oral histories that was the most popular were the Saturday night dances. Every Saturday night dance was packed with people from the surrounding community as well. Cooperative programs for store and gardening. And perhaps one of the most remarkable elements a medical program which involved clinics inside the camps, a nurse that lived in each of these camps, a doctor and dentist that visited twice a week, and a national, perhaps the first, national health care insurance plan for farm workers, so that if they couldn't afford these services, it would be subsidized by the federal government. You could see why it was very much debated. And then finally, here's the democratic element, which would have interested Theodore Roosevelt. It sought to build, more than anything, a sense of democracy and of belonging, of coming towards citizenship. So it sought to make migrant workers, who were often treated as non-citizens because they were transitory, feel that they had a stake in the American condition and in American society. So this is my sort of glass half full, the hope that there was a period in which these ideas and these sort of dreams for something more fair involving immigrants and migrants did come directly from the federal government that could exist. To conclude, I'll pull one more thing from the speech that Theodore Roosevelt gave in Kansas. It's of little use for us to pay loyalty to the mighty men of the past unless we sincerely endeavor to apply to the problems of the present precisely the qualities which in other crises enabled the men of that day to meet their crises. So he's saying not so much that we can learn from history, but that we can learn from how people handled their historical period. And I think that's very inspiring. It certainly has inspired me. I look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you very much.